Good afternoon and welcome everybody. You're joining a JSGS presentation entitled "A Futures Fund for Saskatchewan, 10 Years On." Watching people sign into the chat, but it's a great group attending today and a group of panelists I'm really looking forward to and we'll introduce in a second. My name's Jim Farney. I'm the school's director in Regina and a professor here. I'll be moderating and asking questions. If you've got stuff you would like me to ask, please put it into the chat. The Johnson Shoreham Graduate School of Public Policy is a national hub for research and study of public administration and a partnership between the province's two universities. It dates back to 2007. Working out of Saskatoon and Regina means that we need to recognize and acknowledge that we're working on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, as well as the traditional homeland of the Métis. Peter Mackinnon is joining us today from Canmore, which is on Treaty 7 territory, the traditional homeland of the Stoney Nakota, which is composed of the Bearspaw First Nation, Chiniki First Nations, and Goodstoney First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nations and the Blackfoot Confederacy. I always like to pause after a land acknowledgement and say, these are becoming increasingly easy words to say, but the challenge of thinking through what they mean in terms of governance and economic development is not getting any lighter as we move forward. And I think it's an especial challenge for spaces like ours to open discussion up around how do we put some good action behind good words, and I know we'll talk about some of that today. Our format today is pretty conventional for us, so I'm most of the way through my introductory remarks and logistics stuff. Each of our four speakers will take 7 minutes or so to kind of lay out their sense of the land around our topic, because we're today they even decided they wanted to bring some slides, so I'm looking forward to data and stuff. If you've got questions, like I said, for the Q&A, use the Zoom function to send the questions my way, and I'll lump them together and move them around as makes sense for our conversation. If you don't send me questions, you'll be stuck with an hour of me asking the panelists questions. And while entertaining for me, it won't be for you, I can promise that. It is recorded, so I know you've all checked off on that little Zoom box. And we'll wrap up, around 1:30 or so. I think the reason I'm excited about this panel is the Futures Fund for Saskatchewan was it's a decade on. It was a big picture look at what our economy and the relationship between the provincial state and the economy might be. I think we can all agree that in some ways, the economic situation has changed a lot in the last decade. Some of the challenges remain that we were thinking about them. So what I hoped our panel can do today is give us a look backwards, figure out what a decade ago we thought we were dealing with, look at a road that wasn't really traveled, and then talk about some alternative views of where we're at now and where we might be going, kind of in light of that perspective. Because I think we are in a really interesting space in terms of thinking about that relationship between the government and the economy. Apparently yesterday, Rishi Sunak uttered the phrase industrial policy for the first time in an official speech as premier in the UK. And so, we're just in an interesting space for that sort of thing. And we've got panelists coming from four very different perspectives. So I'll introduce them and then we can get ourselves rolling. Peter Mackinnon, as an aside for writing these interesting little reports about Saskatchewan's economy, is a former law prof and law dean. He served as the president of the University of Saskatchewan for 13 years and as interim president of Athabasca and Dalhousie after that. He's been the sole author or co-editor of 6 books, is an officer of the Order of Canada and recipient of 6 honorary degrees. So he'll kick us off. Matt Smith is the Chief Executive Officer of the Saskatchewan Indigenous Investment Finance Corporation and the Executive Director of the Indigenous Economic Development Branch Government of Saskatchewan. He led the team responsible for developing the Indigenous Investment Finance Corporation and continues to be overall lead for the organization. He has a bachelor's degree in public affairs and policy management from Carleton and a master's degree in global governance and diplomacy from the University of Oxford. He's a proud member of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan and lives here in Regina with his lovely wife, and she is also a good friend of the schools in her own right, I'm pleased to say, with 2 young kids. Kelly Foley is an associate professor in the Department of Economics at USask and an associate member of JSGS. She serves as co-editor for the Canadian Public Policy and is on the management board of the Canadian Labour Economics Forum. Dr. Foley has held previous positions at the Copenhagen Business School and the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation. Her recent research focuses on education and training and how they affect inequality and economic well-being, including questions of intergenerational disadvantage. Lastly, Ron Stiles is an exec in residence with JSGS. His formal education was at the U of R, where he received several degrees, including an MA in economics with a specialization in public finance. He spent 35 years with the government of Saskatchewan in both Crown and executive sectors, and was most recently the president of SaskTel, where he retired in 2017. During his time in government, he oversaw a number of significant restructuring initiatives, including corporate taxation, federal, provincial, territorial housing agreements that devolved social housing to the provinces, SaskTel's evolution to be an internet-based company, and the sale of the province's financial interests in the Sask-Furco fertilizer plant and the Regina oil upgrader. As well as his time with us, he works as a consultant assisting governments, businesses, not-for-profits, and First Nations corporations across Western Canada. So we will roll through the presentations from Peter to Matt to Kelly to Ron. I'll keep rough sense of time, but I'll turn it over to Peter to lead us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, and good afternoon, colleagues all. I would like to, of course, thank the Johnson Cheyenne School for inviting me to participate in this, and of course, the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan. In my allotted time, I want to comment briefly on first, the origins of my report, secondly, the process that I followed, and three, talk a bit about the key recommendations. The origins first. In 2012, as I was stepping away from my time as U of S president, I met with Premier Wall, who asked me to do a study into sovereign wealth funds. I said to him, Premier, I know absolutely nothing about sovereign wealth funds. And he said, well, that's good. You won't have any predisposition. You'll go out and take a look at them and report back to me. And that is what I did. With respect to the process, in addition, of course, to some background reading, I decided to look at select examples of wealth funds, beginning actually with the 1978 Saskatchewan Heritage Fund, subsequently the Alberta Heritage Fund, the Alaska Permanent Fund, and Norway's Government Pension Fund Global, which, as many participants in this session will appreciate, is one of the world's wealthiest and most successful sovereign funds. Based on the advice that I received along the way, I went to London as well and spent 3 days making the rounds of various investment houses that look after the investments of many of the sovereign wealth funds around the world. And I had in-person discussions with more than 70 people along the way whose involvement with these wealth funds was very, very substantial. So that was the process I followed. noting along the way that the Saskatchewan Heritage Fund really became, and maybe from the origins, was a rainy day fund. The Alberta Heritage Fund, less so, but still to a considerable extent, became a rainy day fund. The Alaska Permanent Fund was different. It was structurally kind of more independent. But because there was so much money flowing into that fund in Alaska, some public policy decisions were taken, such as the abolition of state income tax, that had huge ramifications and led to some questioning about what the future of the Alaska Permanent Fund would be. And of course, Norway's government pension fund Global had some very unusual rules and regulations. Its governance was enormously strict, and its investments, they didn't invest in Norway. Certainly, many of the proceeds of the investments over the years come back into the country, but this is a country of 5 million people with an investment fund. I suspect now it would be close to 1.3 or 4 trillion dollars, and one can imagine the impact of that in a country of 5 million. In any event, quickly from process to recommendations, there were 10 of them. The first one was the key one. It was that the province establish a permanent fund. Again, underlining the word permanent fund, the Saskatchewan Futures Fund, for which it would be legislated that the principal is unexpendable. So the focus here was very much on asset conversion rather than asset depletion. We have the benefit of, in Saskatchewan, of wonderful, wonderful resources. And to the extent that we could and should, we should try to preserve them through conversion rather than see them depleted. There were a number of other recommendations that addressed governance, which is absolutely critical and central to this kind of fund. The big issue that we encountered back a decade ago was that Saskatchewan had a considerable dependence on non-renewable resource revenue in year-to-year operations. And so we had to take that into account in the recommendations that were made. And I think it was around at the time, and Ron, you'll know a lot about this too, I think it was around 25% or so of the province's operations were supported by non-renewable resource revenues. So the recommendation was that you're not going to bring that to an end and thereby see the kind of tax increases that would be required for operating funding. That would not have worked. And so we recommended that the province's dependence on non-renewable resource revenues would be capped at its then levels, and that resource revenues over that cap would become part of the permanent wealth fund. So I think, Jim, that I will leave it at that. That is my kind of overview, and I hope kicks off.
Thank you, Peter. Matt, you're next, I believe.
Thank you. So, excuse me. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you to the Johnson Chuama Graduate School for allowing me to join you today to discuss the Saskatchewan Indigenous Investment Finance Corporation. I thought I'd use the short presentation here just to provide a brief overview of the corporation. Karen, if you can move to the next slide, please. So I just want to discuss some of the driving factors for the establishment of the SIFC, what the approach to the development of it was, some of the governance and operational structures, and what we believe some of the opportunities are for the corporation. So next slide, please. Sorry. So the creation of the SIFC was driven by a number of factors. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, several goals were included in Saskatchewan's growth plan to support economic reconciliation, including goals related to growing Indigenous participation in the resource sector. There was certainly an interest, and remains an interest from industry, driven by a desire to make progress on TRC Call to Action 92, which, if any of you aren't aware, is we call upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a reconciliation framework and apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous people and their lands and resources. Also, a number of financial and insurance institutions are utilizing environmental, social, and governance evaluations as a predictor of the long-term success of a project or company. And in order to access financing and insurance, as well as attract employees and customers, several companies are prioritizing ESGs. Having Indigenous investors, employees, and procurement and supply chain partners can positively impact ESG scores, and some companies are prioritizing those relationships. An additional factor was just the number of requests the government of Saskatchewan was receiving from Indigenous communities and organizations for loans, loan guarantees, and grants to support their purchase of equity and resource projects, and these ranged from $500,000 to over $1 billion. And in order to support the achievement of the growth plan goals related to growing Indigenous participation in the resource sector, we needed to develop a better understanding of what barriers were preventing Indigenous communities and organizations from more actively participating in the province's resource sector. So the Ministry of Trade and Export Development provided some funding to the Saskatchewan First Nations Natural Resource Centre of Excellence, which is an affiliate to the FSIN, to conduct outreach to both Indigenous communities and organizations, as well as industry, to try to identify what was preventing larger participation from Indigenous communities in the resource sector. And the Centre of Excellence identified the lack of access to sufficient capital as the #1 barrier. So to help address this barrier, the government of Saskatchewan decided to develop a mechanism to help support access to sufficient cost-effective capital. Next slide, please. So when it came to developing the SIFC, the government used, I would say, what was quite a unique approach. So first of all, we were fortunate that Alberta had already undertaken the establishment of an Access to Capital Corporation, the AIOC, and we were able to meet with the AIOC officials on several occasions to ask them questions about their experience. We also entered into a contract with a firm that had supported the development and launch of the AIOC, who brought a tremendous amount of relevant experience and resources, which were able to help us develop the SIFC much quicker and more cost effectively than we would have been otherwise. We also knew that we would need to make a number of program, operational, and governance decisions as we developed the SIFC, and to help ensure Indigenous perspectives and priorities, as well as expertise, were incorporated. We brought together a group of Indigenous advisors who provided input throughout the development of the SIFC. We were also able to work closely with a number of government ministries, most consistently, I would say, the Ministry of Finance, to ensure we were incorporating their input as well. And also just wanted to mention, that both our ministry's leadership and the government as a whole made the SIFC and the development of it a priority. It was only 8 months from when it was announced until it was launched, which I think is extraordinary, given nothing like it had ever been done in Saskatchewan before. Next slide, please. So how does the SIFC operate? So the SIFC supports Indigenous communities and organizations' equity ownership in key economic drivers in Saskatchewan: resource, value-added agriculture, and energy projects. The SIFC has one employee who focuses solely on the corporation, and as Jim mentioned in my bio, I split my time between the SIFC as well as the Indigenous Economic Development Branch with Ted. So to save time and money and have access to a broader range of expertise, a decision was made to utilize external organizations to evaluate SIFC applications. These evaluators, which were selected through a public RFP process, conduct an assessment of the applications and then make a recommendation to the SIFC Board of Directors. The SIFC also utilizes external legal counsel with expertise in financial transactions and loan guarantees to help the corporation move closer to the speed of business. The SIFC has a 5-person board of directors who have the authority to approve or reject loan guarantee applications. These decisions aren't made at the political level. In addition to government officials, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations and the Métis Nation Saskatchewan also appoint representatives to the board. There is a small administrative charge for successful loan guarantee applications, which cover the organization's operational costs. So the goal of the SIFC is to only approve loan guarantee applications with a risk profile that indicates that the loan will be repaid in full. This, along with the small administrative charge, mean that the SIFC will likely have zero cost to the government of Saskatchewan. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight some of the opportunities that the SIFC will help facilitate. So in April 2022, Saskatchewan was identified as the youngest province in Canada, with almost 1 in 5 of all people under the age of 15. Indigenous youth are the driver of this trend. According to the 2021 census, almost half the province's Indigenous population is under 25, compared to 28% for non-Indigenous people. Indigenous people, particularly young Indigenous people, are a hugely untapped source of much-needed labor in the province and will help drive the province's economy into the future. Indigenous ownership and projects will bring more Indigenous people into the resource, value-added agriculture, and energy sectors. So in his 2011 report, University of Saskatchewan professor Eric Howe reported that the value beyond any social or moral purpose of bringing the bridging the Indigenous education gap and bringing the Saskatchewan Indigenous population to the same economic level as the broader population is a $90 billion opportunity. The Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business released their National Indigenous Economic Strategy last year that included a number of interesting statistics. One of which is, if Indigenous people had access to the same level of economic opportunities available to other Canadians, it would create 135,000 newly employed people and an additional 6.9 billion in income per year. Indigenous people have a tremendous amount of traditional knowledge and business acumen, along with a unique lens on sustainability, which can contribute to the long-term success of a business or a project. Indigenous ownership and projects will help secure more board seats for Indigenous people in corporate Canada. A 2020 report found that only 0.3% of corporate board seats are currently held by Indigenous people in Canada, so there's obviously a lot of room for growth. I've just included a list, sorry, not a list, but a few areas where Indigenous equity ownership can help encourage success. So you'll see critical minerals, renewable energy, SMRs, energy export infrastructure. So there's a misconception that Indigenous people are opposed to all resource development. What I would say is there are certain projects that, for a broad range of reasons, Indigenous communities and rights holders will never support. But what I would say is much more common is Indigenous communities are opposed to projects taking place in their territory that they're gaining no meaningful benefit from. Indigenous communities are looking to move beyond impact benefit agreements and a few jobs. They want to benefit from the entire life cycle of projects taking place on their territory. And equity ownership, which the SIFC can help facilitate, can help Indigenous communities and organizations do that, which we believe will help advance economic reconciliation in the province. So just in the next slide, that's the end for me. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think I'm up next, and can we move to the first slide here? So thank you very much. That was a very inspiring summary, Matt. I'm in a way, I'm happy to be following that because it definitely feeds into some of the things that I'd like to say today. And I want to start with a quick summary. And I'm going to summarize things that I think a lot of people in the audience will be familiar with, but I think it's a good idea to remind ourselves of some of these kind of stylized facts. But I want to start with a summary of how resource cycles affect labor markets. And the first thing to note is that employment in extractive industries is actually quite small across Canada. And of course, it's a larger share in Saskatchewan, where the employment in mining, quarrying, oil and gas extractive industries represents about 3.5% to 4%. So although larger than Canada as a whole, it's small relative to, for example, healthcare, social assistance, and education, which represents about 24% of employment in the province. Even though it is a relatively small sector, it has enormous impacts on our economy. So there's evidence that when demand for labor in the resource sectors increase, that spills over into other sectors in local economies. And recently, researchers from York University and UBC have argued that when wages are going up in the resource-rich parts of Canada, that allows workers in other parts of Canada to bargain for higher wages. So, for example, if I'm a worker in Ontario, I can go to my employer and say, look, if you don't give me a raise, I'm going to become a long-distance commuter and I'm going to go work in Saskatchewan. And so these researchers have estimated that almost a half of all wage gains across Canada between 2000 and 2012 can be attributed to these kinds of spillovers. So it's really important to keep in mind that the effects of the resource sector are woven throughout our economies, which is fantastic when resource prices are high. Next slide, please. But another fact that we can't ignore is that resource prices are very volatile. So here I'm showing you the unemployment rates for Saskatchewan in green, of course, compared to Alberta in blue and then Canada in black. So unemployment rates are one measure that's really quite sensitive to business cycles. So in this picture, we're going to be able to see how resource volatility might be correlated with labor market performance. So you can see that the first vertical line in the red vertical line in the picture is marking the beginning of the 2008 financial crisis. And you'll see that unemployment barely moves in Saskatchewan. So Saskatchewan didn't really experience the 2008 financial crisis like the rest of Canada did. During the whole first half of the 2010s, when oil prices were high in Saskatchewan and Alberta, had unemployment rates that were almost 3 points lower than the rest of Canada. So that's a huge difference in unemployment. When oil prices start to fall in 2015, in Saskatchewan and Alberta, unemployment rises. And if we look at that increase in Saskatchewan's unemployment, that's about the same size as the 2008 recession for the rest of Canada. So we have a lot of volatility that's happening in Saskatchewan that's moving more with oil prices than with the business cycles of the rest of Canada. And then if we take a look at the pre-COVID years in Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan is experiencing unemployment rates that are around the Canadian average. So next slide. Okay, so if we wanted to diversify our economy to try and dampen the boom-bust cycle, one way of doing that is rebalancing our emphasis on human versus natural resources. So enrollment in post-secondary education tends to move with unemployment. So when there are downturns, enrollment expands. So that's good in a sense that individuals respond to the incentives, the messages that are coming from the economy. As a whole, Saskatchewan lags behind Canada in terms of educational attainment, and that's been historically true. What I'm showing you here, I guess it's a little bit small, the numbers, but here I'm showing you the educational attainment for 24 to 54-year-olds in 2021. And you can see that Saskatchewan is almost 9 points behind Canada in the share with a post-secondary credential. So there's certainly a lot of room to change this distribution. And I think Matt alluded to a lot of that potential in his introduction as well. And just, we might want to improve higher levels of education, not only because it's associated with better labor market outcomes, but it's also important to point out that it's associated with a whole range of non-pecuniary benefits. So next slide. So what do we know about how to improve educational outcomes and skills development? So first, investing in the early years has been shown to be shown to have the largest impacts, particularly from children in economically disadvantaged environments. And for a long time, at least in the economics literature, there was a bit of a back and forth about whether or not school funding for the K-12 sector actually improved long-term outcomes. And more recent work that has been very careful about trying to disentangle causal mechanisms from correlation has concluded that school funding does, in fact, improve student outcomes, and it improves student outcomes over the long run. So it shows up in adult outcomes as well. So that's a hopeful sign that this is a mechanism that that policy can affect. So while investment in early childhood and K to 12 are the most cost-effective ways of changing the skill mix in the economy, that strategy is about generational change. Training programs are one possible avenue to affect skills within a generation, and training can be very effective, but it's not universally effective. It seems to be sort of least effective in terms of retraining older displaced workers. But I do want to point out that, and Matt also spoke about some of this evidence in his talk, that there is a growing amount of evidence that training and employment programs that are delivered by local Indigenous organizations for Indigenous participants are very effective at increasing earnings and employment. So for a concrete example, that's the kind of work that the Gabriel Dumont Institute does in Saskatchewan. And finally, in sectors in sort of OECD type countries, in sectors where the employment is growing and where wages are growing, soft skills are very important. And by which I mean skills like communication and teamwork. So we know a lot about how to raise levels of literacy and how to raise numeracy. Teachers are very good at generating those skills. We know a lot less about how to generate these kinds of soft skills, even as they are becoming more important. So I'm going to leave it there for my intro, and I look very much forward to the conversation.
It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and likewise, I'm looking forward to getting into the actual discussion. But I want to set out some framework aspects to looking at things like sovereign funds, to talking about rainy day funds, the type of constructs that we're talking about this afternoon. So maybe the first slide, Karen. So maybe the first thing to look at is the environment from an economic perspective. And if you go back into the period where Peter was creating his report for Saskatchewan, we just come off a fairly significant economic boom. And in fact, even into 2013 through 2017, those two 5-year periods, okay, Saskatchewan is doing very well economically. Today is a different picture. It's a different economic situation with the province of Saskatchewan. Over the last 5 years, we've had a very tough economic situation. COVID not being the only issue there, but commodity prices haven't done very well, and just generally the Saskatchewan economy has been quite a laggard. Like, move on to the second slide. So if you look at it from a perspective of how other provinces did, and you look at Saskatchewan within sort of that context, okay, Saskatchewan again was first in the country during the years where Peter put together the report. But if you look to today, okay, we're lagging the rest of Canada. We have a pretty significant issue. Okay, we need to sort of break out of the situation that we find ourselves in right now and be able to grow our economy, or we're going to gradually begin to see further problems begin to pop up. All of this ties into the financial pressures that the government is under and is going to be under over the next number of years. The next slide, Karen. If you look at 2022, which was a great year for Saskatchewan, so within the context of the last 5 years, it is the one year that stands out as being quite significant. We led the nation in terms of real GDP growth, somewhere around 5.7%. If you look at nominal GDP, which again doesn't take out price increases, it's actually over 20%. So very, very, very significant. But you want to remember the context of 2022. It was the start of the Ukrainian-Russian war. What you had was a pretty significant increase in commodity prices. But not only just in terms of commodity prices, okay, but the volume of the commodities was available in the markets. That really was the reason why those commodity prices increased. Whether it was sanctions or the inability of Ukraine to actually produce some of the products, especially the agricultural products, all of it created a specific issue and a problem that resulted in, again, a bit of a boom here in Saskatchewan. The province, from a public finance perspective, benefited greatly from it. And you simply have to look to the table to the right at commodity prices. And I would draw your attention to potash prices, Canadian dollars per KTO ton. They jumped from $546 a ton in 2021 all the way up to $1,334.80 a ton. in 2022. Now, they look like they're going to moderate somewhat, but they're still artificially supported by world economic conditions right now. So we may have a great 2023-24, maybe a 24-25, but eventually we're going to get back to something that approaches a normal world economy. It just depends on what year you believe potentially the war might be over. If I can get you to move to the next slide, Karen. So if you bring this all back to the whole question of sovereign wealth funds, this whole issue about what are they there for, there is the intergenerational aspects of it, obviously, and Peter has explained quite nicely the idea of depletion versus conversion. But when you sort of go one layer below that, it's really all about how do you hold back spending? Okay, people naturally want to spend that money that comes in a country such as Norway, for instance. If you were to try to somehow spend that 1.3 trillion that had been coming in over the history of that particular sovereign fund, you'd probably have very large inflation. You probably would have displaced a lot of the capital that individuals and businesses would have brought to the economy. So, you know, the whole purpose behind that, in a sense, okay, is to allow the economy to grow and actually do the conversion, like Peter said. It makes great sense. But is Saskatchewan in the same position? Well, if you go back to 2008 through 2012, we had an accumulated surplus in those 5 years of $4.3 billion. You know, we were in a position where we were able to start to accumulate some pretty significant dollars. And so the idea of potentially doing a sovereign fund made a lot of sense. But if you look at the last 5 years, we're talking about an accumulated deficit of over $2 billion. It's a much different circumstance that we're facing today than we were just over a decade ago. On top of it, you know, we have some headwinds from a public finance perspective. Revenues from high commodity prices are probably not going to be around in by the end of the medium term. You're already seeing Russia begin to sort of outflank the sanctions. They're selling their oil, natural gas to other countries, okay, that they have some type of an alliance with or some sort of a partnership with, China being an example, India being another example. The same thing is likely going to occur when it comes to potash, I would suggest. Potash will begin to flow potentially out of Russia. They will move it into countries that are looking for that commodity, maybe displace even Saskatchewan potash, which is now flowing into Europe. So it's a very odd circumstance. It's displacement. So that may bring down potash prices. And you may see some of the same when it comes to agriculture as well. But again, the economy will adjust to some of those things. And again, I would suggest that you're probably seeing high commodity prices begin to fall in the medium term. There's also intense expense pressures, pardon me, when it comes to health and education right now. We have staff shortages and population growth from immigration, a problem Saskatchewan hasn't seen for a long time. But that means that we're going to have to invest more money into schools. We're going to have to invest more money into universities if you want to continue to develop those soft skills that Kelly was talking about. I would also surmise that interest costs are going to grow a lot faster than they have in the past. We've got a very aggressive capital program going on in the province. We're adding a lot of debt right now as well, and we're going to actually end up, I think, at a higher interest rate plateau. That means that our interest costs are going to grow from where they are today, which is in that $700 to $800 million level, probably into over $1 billion in the next 3, 4, 5 years. And again, all those things are going to be challenges for the province. So it's a much different environment today than it would have been in 2012. And governments are going to have to work within that new environment. So I'll stop there, Jim, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you. That's kind of 4 very, very different kind of perspectives and takes, I think, on our outlook. Thanks to Ron for putting the dismal back in the dismal science that is economics. It's always good to have somebody around to do that for us. I mean, and there's a lot of things we can pull on here, but I think maybe one place we can start is a question of kind of government capacity. And I don't mean that in an ideological way. I mean that in terms of the policy capacity to do the work and engage in the type of development that each of you are setting out. So Matt, you talked about how small the investment fund is in terms of people and how you've gone kind of to outside firms and consultancies to pull in the expertise. I'm curious in terms of contrasting that. You know, we're all familiar with the McKinsey stuff for the feds, but what Peter saw when he looked internationally at what it would take to run this type of fund? You know, Raw, in your experience, like whichever of these different paths we were to choose to emphasize, what would we need to add in kind of a simple public administration way to make it function in the province in kind of the roads you've laid out for us? And does the capacity exist today in the province to do that? Maybe Peter, you could tell us about what you thought such a fund would need in terms of, you know, headquarters staff.
Well, I think the other speakers, and in particular, Ron, have spoken to the differences between 2012 and 2023, and the differences are sharp. Certainly, when there was, as one of the slides indicated, a $4.3 billion accumulated surplus over 4 or 5 years from 2008 to 12, that was a propitious time in which to talk about a sovereign wealth fund. And it had a fair amount of credibility. And I think in the early going legs, I think there's no doubt in my mind that the then Premier was interested in establishing a sovereign wealth fund. But for a number of reasons, that became less urgent, less pressing, and in the last 4 or 5 years, remote. I guess the thing that I'm concerned about is that in the event of a substantial upturn, and for example, a repeat of the years 2008 to 12 or 4.3 billion accumulated surplus or even more, unless you have a plan for how you are going to deal with those monies, you're likely simply to use them in an unplanned fashion. And so I think the idea of a sovereign wealth fund, while it has receded in terms of pressures for it, it may return. And I think it would be a good idea to think about its potential return and what we're going to do about it. And I would hope a wealth fund would figure into the discussion.
Thanks. Matt, in terms of, you know, thinking of taking the Indigenous investment cooperation to scale, like what would have to happen as it grows, as the place of Indigenous people in our economy starts to look more like the demographic story you laid out? How do you think that might play out if you were to kind of think forward 10 years? What would your shop look like that far out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, you know, the demand for the loan guarantees the SIFC provides is certainly very high. You know, I should mention part of the rationale for, you know, utilizing external advisors as well as external legal counsel is the government of Saskatchewan has currently committed $75 million in loan guarantees. And while that certainly is a lot of money in some ways, it can also be eaten up pretty quickly, you know, through a relatively small number of applications. And, you know, it's not worth, or we didn't feel it was worth, you know, bringing in a full contingent of staff, or, you know, the possibility that the 75 million in loan guarantees could go within 6 months, and then what do you do with those people, right? So, you know, I referenced the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation in my presentation, and they've kind of gone the other way. And I mean, they have $1 billion in loan guarantees currently available, and they have a relatively large contingent of staff. I think they're usually sit around somewhere between 10 to 15, and that's everybody from, you know, people they've hired directly, you know, from financial institutions and investment houses and whatnot to do a lot of the analysis in-house, to engagement staff, to, you know, legal representation in-house. And their structures, I believe they receive, I think it's $4 million a year from the government of Alberta in operational costs. They also charge an administrative fee on successful loan applications, which kind of brings down that, but I believe those to kind of be their annual, you know, operational costs. So if the government of Saskatchewan decides to, you know, sustain the SIFC, I think there would be a discussion about what portion of that kind of expertise we'd like to bring in-house, or is the preference to continue to use, external evaluators? When I say external evaluators, like I said, it was a public RFP process. It's not a secret. It's, Deloitte and Ernst & Young, right? Like they're global, large companies with a very broad range of expertise. And to bring in a similar level of expertise within government would be very challenging. And also, whilst the IOC has a substantial operational budget, they also utilize external, contractors as well to help with that analysis. So that discussion would certainly have to be revisited in the future.
Ron or Kelly, any opinions on that from where you guys sit?
Well, my experience, I would tell you that what Matt has outlined is the right way to approach it, because 75 million is not that much in terms of loan guarantees, and bringing outside expertise in to do the evaluations. To me, anything that you can do to exclude sort of government or political oversight of some of this, you're probably getting a better product at the other end. One of the aspects of it that I think will be important from a long-term perspective is where the focus is going to be in terms of actually, providing the guarantees. Is it going to be more about participation in the existing economy versus development of sort of new opportunities, and how much of a diversification? You tend to find a lot of capital markets that are willing to get into, or capital participants that are willing to get into natural resources. It's a pretty well-known area, and whether you're talking about oil and gas, or whether you're talking about maybe other minerals, et cetera, a lot of that is already there. Where right now I think there's maybe a lack of capital is in some of the smaller industries, some of the smaller businesses. And this leads back to what I think needs to be a greater focus on diversification in the province. Right now, we're so heavily dependent on the 3 F's, fuel, fertilizer, and farms, that it tends to put us, back into these wild swings, as Kelly had pointed out with a couple of her graphs. And I think one of the things we want to try to do is, again, to diversify a little bit more than we have. And it's odd to go back to the 1970s, early 1980s. That was really the economic policies of the day, was to try to get diversification in place, to really ensure that you weren't so susceptible to those wild swings, because it's hard on your labor force. We maintain a low employment in the province because a lot of those people end up migrating to somewhere else to work. And so if you want to maintain that labor force here in the province that you're developing, you need to ensure you've got the long-term work. So again, I think part of it is for the government to look at, any of the capital programs from the perspective of what are the, the economic imperatives that you're trying to put in place.
And I can perhaps add to the conversation, but I just wanted to just really briefly reflect on how kind of sad that intergenerational loss is in terms of what we could have had. I came to the province in 2012, and I feel enormously the privilege that it was to come here, have a starting salary at the top of the boom. Those are lasting effects, and I don't want to go, we can't go back and change that, but I just wanted to sort of point out that's kind of sad. But in terms of the issue of capacity, I think is absolutely fascinating, a little bit from the point of view of having been an undergraduate chair in the last year, and I wonder to what extent more integration between the post-secondary institutions and government can help improve capacity, capacity and renewal. Some of the programs that the JSGS does could certainly be emulated by other parts of the PSC sector. And I think one other thing that's worth bearing or sort of commenting on is that we have so much talent in Saskatchewan, right? There's so much talent here, but we'll always have a scale issue that I think reflects in the, there'll probably always be a necessity in terms of our size and scale to rely on some external resources. And so I think it's important for us to kind of remember that isolation is maybe not the best strategy for Saskatchewan.
I will hold off on my temptation to go down the PSE rabbit hole for now, Kelly, because I will show some restraint. And there's a really neat question for Matt in the first instance, but I think secondarily for Ron. The question narrowly is about Indigenous communities and small modular nuclear reactors and how they're viewing it. But I think it opens up a broader question around, the amount of capital that has to go into the energy transition from the government side of things. I don't think we were thinking about in 2011, and SMRs are going to be such a massive capital investment on part of the Crowns that it will kind of pull our attention to that sector. So I wonder, Matt, if you could kind of speak to the Indigenous side of that transition, and Ron, if you could kind of think about how that type of investment will play out and maybe take the room that we might otherwise have for investments at that scale.
Sure, thank you. I would say in regards to a number of the renewable energy projects in the province, Indigenous communities and economic development corporations are already leaders. Cowessess First Nation has a couple of renewable energy projects. George Gordon First Nation and Star Blanket brought a project near Weyburn online last year. George Gordon is continuing to explore opportunities on their territory as well, and there seems to be, I would say, quite a comfort in the renewable space by Indigenous communities, both with existing technology and moving forward. And in Saskatchewan and particularly in the far north, some of the largest and most established Indigenous economic development corporations got their start really in the uranium sector. And so there's a comfort with the industry, but I think there's also an awareness that to help how, Indigenous communities can help, maintain the uranium sector, not just in Saskatchewan, but Canada and globally, and ensure that demand for Saskatchewan uranium remains high is in their long-term economic interest as well. And I'm aware of a number of Indigenous communities and economic development corporations that are looking to be active players in the small modular reactor space. And those discussions are obviously continuing. And what I would say as well is, in addition to opportunities with SaskPower, is a number of major players in the province are looking to reduce their GHG footprint through the use of renewables directly on site for some of their projects. And as far as I'm aware, they're all planning to have Indigenous partners in those projects. And I know some kind of discussions are ongoing with SaskPower about how that could kind of be facilitated, but the interest is very high. And I think, moving forward, as SMRs, the opportunities for SMRs become clear, I think you can certainly expect to have a number of Indigenous players be key partners in those developments.
Maybe, Jim, I would add, I completely agree with Matt. This is a developing area, and I think First Nations, as well as regular investors, are all watching it very carefully to see what the opportunities might be. I would approach it from a little different perspective. The size of the investment that we're talking about here, I mean, by the end of this decade, the province is going to have debt probably over $40 billion. Something in that range. They're projecting 37 billion, I think it is, by 2027. So, add a few more billion on, and into the next decade, you're going to be up at $40 billion. The last estimate on small modular reactors by the Minister of SaskPower, I believe, was for $7 billion per 300 megawatt reactor. 10 years of inflation, I got to believe you're talking at least $10 billion per reactor, and probably more the further out you look. If you were to do 3 of these reactors, which seems to be sort of a logical number, because you got to create economies of scale, you're probably talking another $30+ billion in investments. This is very substantial for the province. I mean, we're not a very large jurisdiction. And so there's going to be some real issues around capital rationing here, where that money comes from. And I got to believe at some point, the federal government is going to have to step in and assist a province like Saskatchewan or maybe Nova Scotia and, you know, whoever else, where there's going to be this large transition. I mean, the transitions are largest where you have systems that are primarily coal-fired at the present time for base load. And so that's going to be a large issue. And as part and parcel of that, it would seem to me, you know, getting or having First Nations be part and parcel of those developments will be critical. You know, they bring a certain amount of financing that's available to them directly. Plus, on top of it, the federal government, you know, obviously has obligations to First Nations, and so again, it opens the door, I think, to bring more federal funding to this particular issue. From a long-term perspective as well, the reactors themselves, I mean, they're a specialized technology, but the reactors connect to the same type of boilers that you find in coal-fired generation or any other types of generation that's out there. And so a lot of that is not unique, and it can be supported by Saskatchewan companies, Saskatchewan firms, and hopefully a large portion of that, or a portion of it at least, will end up being First Nations firms that support it as well. So there's a real opportunity here, I think, over the next period of time, but there is going to be some pretty significant capital rationing issues here, and the province is going to have lots of partners, including the federal government.
Thanks for that chance. I will go down the PSE rabbit hole, but I haven't, you guys have not disagreed yet. So I'm going to try and set this up as a little bit of perhaps a disagreement between Kelly and Peter. Peter, with all of his experience as a university president, has stressed the importance of keeping politics and lobbying and all this sort of short-termism out of long-term thinking about investment in our province, whether it's futures fund side or, you know, in each of the areas that folks are talking about. Kelly's made a pretty resounding case for investment to bring us up to national levels in PSE achievement, which sounds like a lobbyist's case to me. It's a good one. On the kind of people side of this future that we're thinking, is there any way to square that, to have a non-political way to make sure to get jobs out of these types of investments? Or does this just become a bit of an academic exercise, and at some point we need to accept the Kellys of the world will make convincing cases for their sectors?
We're probably going to agree. I don't know. Do you want to start, Peter, or I don't. Yeah, I think you're muted though. Okay, well, I didn't hear that, but I guess I'll dive in. So I'll start by saying that I said if we want to. But I will say that as an economist and a person who focuses on inequality, there's no economic reason not to prefer an equal distribution. So any society can have any preferences it wants over the distribution of wealth. That's not an economic question. That's an ethical question, a political question, a moral question. Whether or not education improves inequality is not clear at all. Education raises averages, but it doesn't necessarily mean that things will be equally distributed. So sort of trying to come back to the central question about, maybe you can remind me, you wanted us to talk about long-termism versus.
Yeah, it's kind of the long-term question, and the I find where you landed kind of an interesting difference in that, you know, I think the data you had made a fairly strong case for investing in people, and investing in people means investing in institutions. That's very different from the Norway model of we're not even going to invest in Norway. We will invest in diversified capital markets internationally, and it will be the kind of follow-on effects that help Norway out. Those are two quite different things. And
Sure, but I don't.
I'm sorry, I'm not putting it as sharply.
Yeah,
as
no, but I don't think
one
you can,
is what
Norway had enormous increase, went from being one of the sort of lowest levels of education to being one of the highest levels of education. And it's a, so I don't think you can fully separate those things out. That the fact that they happened at the same time when, it is too complicated to say whether it just happened by happenstance or whether there was actual mechanisms that were driving it. But you certainly, the sovereign wealth fund in Norway is definitely concurrent with the huge increases in education, and that Norway is now one of the richer countries in Europe. So you can't separate that out. And I think there's tons of evidence sort of globally that growth coincides with countries that grow rapidly are also countries that have very fast declining shares of people with less than high school. So, and I think that this is not an economic argument, but I think it's still an important argument to make, is that, as you said, we are treaty people and we have treaty obligations. And I think that the fact that meeting those obligations in a proper way, which probably means growth in investment that is faster to make up for shortfalls, is also economically efficient. I don't know if those are my thoughts. Whether they answered your question or not, I don't know.
And I see Peter unmuted himself, so yeah.
Yeah, a few comments that I hope will be close to being on point. I've become even more conscious in the last 5 or 6 years in which I've been living out of Saskatchewan. I've become even more conscious of the extraordinary opportunities that are or that will be available there. The range and the diversity of resources is an extraordinary asset. The youth of the population, and in particular the Indigenous population, as we've been reminded by Matt, offers tremendous opportunities to the province going forward. I think of just one thing, natural gas alone. The possibilities there are fabulous. Saskatchewan and Alberta's lower numbers, by the way, Alberta has relatively low numbers of post-secondary participation too. And I think that may well reflect, not just in Alberta, but in Alberta and Saskatchewan, the other opportunities that have been available that have been, in the short term at least, very tempting for high school graduates to jump into what was a pretty good employment market, less so now. But to me, we should be tremendously optimistic about the future of this part of Canada generally, certainly Saskatchewan's future. And we should look to the 2 universities and to the rest of the education capacity in the province to ensure that the kinds of things that need to be done to address and realize that future are done. I think there's been a very good history of that at both, certainly U of S and U of R, as I experienced it. I think the development of this wonderful Johnson Shoyama School, originally University of Regina, but now a kind of a partnership between the 2 universities in ways that I think can be very productive going forward and involve more parts of the universities in a discussion about their contributions to the economy to come. So optimism, potential, opportunity. I think those themes are the strongest themes that come to my mind, at least as I think about the future.
Peter, there is a question from the audience, kind of curious about the the governance pieces you saw as especially important to ensure the independence of such a fund, and kind of how long it took Norway, for example, for the fund to become mature enough that all the players were used to the idea that it was a nonpartisan enterprise?
It took a while, of course. Norway's wealth fund was originally built largely upon North Sea oil. And as it developed, you can imagine all of the questions that have been asked about a sovereign wealth fund anywhere would have been asked there. I think the fact that they got in early, that they made the commitment quickly and early to ensure that they were going to convert the opportunities associated with North Sea oil into long-term opportunities for the country. That was extremely important because they did not start to spend that money, depend on that money, integrated into operating budgets. None of that was done. Now, even if some of it had been done, there would still have been a lot that could have been put into a wealth fund. But the governance of the fund took some time to develop as well. The initial fund, the permanent fund, the idea, for example, that you should not invest directly from North Sea oil monies into the Norwegian economy, but put it in a fund like this, which actually was monitored and supervised in London, England. There was these ideas did not come easily, and they did not come quickly. But the fact is, they did come. And eventually I asked the question when I was in Norway, I asked the question, so what would happen if the government chose to spend 1/3 of this fund tomorrow? I said, the government just couldn't do it. It would not be possible. Politically, it would not be possible because the fund has now become so well understood by the population, so well understood, and its purpose is well understood. And its integrity and independence well understood, that it would not be possible to break down those barriers and make it a rainy day fund or an investment fund directly.
So I will, to the audience, I'm happy to be looking for questions from you. I'm trying to pull threads, but please keep them coming in. Ron, if I understand your presentation rightly, you would say we're now at the start of a rainy day, and we should be thinking about our public sector, public finances in those terms for the next 5 to 7 years. Is, as Peter says, this the time to be starting to think about how we would do this type of fund, or do you see a different set of mechanisms as being kind of the really important ones that smart people in the Ministry of Finance ought to be thinking about, given that midterm outlook?
No, I mean, I think it is the time to start thinking about these things. If you wait till the money's here, it's very difficult to all of a sudden sort of change and begin to apply the ideas and the principles. Excuse me. One of the large problems, obviously, anytime you look at governments, is that they tend to operate in very short periods of time, 4 years, okay, maybe 8 years, et cetera. If a government can actually sort of jump over that and start to think longer term, funds like that make a lot of sense. They do. I think even in Saskatchewan, okay, there's potentially a role, much like Peter's outlined, okay, and potentially, okay, from an investment perspective. One of the stories I'm aware of from the Norwegian fund, for instance, is a company called Yara. And if you're not aware of who Yara is, they actually own the fertilizer plant just outside of Regina right now. Yara is a Norwegian company. They were originally owned in large part by the Norwegian Sovereignty Fund. And so they used some of that to help grow the company. But at a point in time, they actually paid back the sovereign fund, and they became a public company on the public market. And so It's not each idea is separate. It's these ideas need to interface with one another to make sure that you're trying to achieve very, very broad objectives. And so these kind of funds, in setting them up, you can tie them into economic development. You can tie them into, how do you actually grow your economy at the same time as you are, building out the fund. And you can do it in a way that, maintains that kind of independence that you're talking about. I mean, that's really what's important, but you have to take a long-term view of it. And again, it's very difficult for governments to take a long-term view. Governments like to spend money, obviously, because that's what gets them, they think that's what gets them reelected. I'm not sure I fully agree with that, but they believe that's what gets them reelected. And there is lots and lots of pressures for any government, whether you're in Saskatchewan or you're in another government, but it takes a certain level of discipline. And if you don't exercise that kind of discipline and, manage the level of new capital expenditures, for instance, you're not going to get to that long-term planning, that long-term thought. Capital investments, we always think of them as hard assets, but, there's investments we make in soft skills as well, which Kelly has talked about, to a large extent. It's very important to be making those kind of investments as well. And again, they're not the same as a capital investment. You're not going to amortize them over a period as well, but you need to have all these pieces that, fit together, okay, to carry out the long-term agenda that you want for a particular jurisdiction. And Canadian provinces seem to have a hard time doing that. Alberta, I always thought, did a pretty good job of it in the past, but they had a government that was in place for a very, very long period of time, okay, and really subscribed to the same political philosophy and the same approach. Saskatchewan, we seem to really change a lot, between even party leaders, okay, and Jim, you mentioned a couple of times. I mean, if you look at our present government and where they are with economic policy, it's more like an industrial policy right now, versus what was in place during the Wall years, which was a lot more about a low tax economy. Try to make sure that you're providing an environment within which businesses can actually flourish. Okay. And then you've had governments that have been very interventionist in the past as well. So you're finding a little bit of everything, and they keep changing from one approach to another approach, et cetera. And I think that, creates some of the issues and the problems. But no, I think now is the right time to be thinking about these things and actually fashioning long-term policy, as you go out. And Matt's organization is a good example of that. I don't know which companies you have invested in that so far, or which companies, you provide guarantees for, but the benefits of all of that in terms of the long-term for Saskatchewan, okay, is only going to be known in 5 and 10 years, probably out. It's not like it's going to be 1 year from now. We'll know that it's a mighty success, and it's created this number of jobs, and it's helped diversify the economy. It's longer term plays, and you have to be patient with some of that. It's patient capital essentially. But yeah, again, you got to start now, Jim, would be my perspective.
So Dawn in the chat has a question. Well, okay, if they were to start now, what critical decisions or policies would they need to implement, and what would the midterm effect on our budget be? It's not on the table for today, obviously, but let's say the government was to say, starting immediately, this sounds like a great idea. Peter, I suppose you were the one who would have thought this through the most carefully. What would a start? You're muted, Peter.
Sorry, what's the question again, Jim?
What in really concrete terms would starting a sovereign wealth fund, or starting a fund today mean? If tomorrow the premier stands up and says we're pushing the button on this, what might that look like?
Well, it might look like establishing the structure, establishing the governance. I could imagine an initial investment. In fact, when this work was done a decade ago, it was suggested that we should see an initial investment of $100 million just to put it in place, and to put the governance in place so that when opportunities follow to add to it, you've got the structure, you've got the governance, you've got the basic format. I think that's my answer.
You know, Jim, the thing I would add to that, Peter's right on, that's where you would start. The thing I would add to it is the development of a mechanism as well that determines how much you're going to put into it based upon maybe it's commodity prices, maybe it's some definition of a maximum percentage of renewable resource revenues going back to the province, to the provincial budget. But there needs to be that kind of a mechanism that is established and agreed upon. And I think, Peter, in your report, you talked about sort of all party political support. And if it was possible to, you know, to achieve that, to bring all the parties together, to recognize that that formula needs to be endorsed commonly, that would make it a lot easier on a government, you know, when the time comes that, you know, they are moving money into it from a resource windfall, like you could have done in 2022, for instance. But, you know, I think those are some of the things as well that doing them today in isolation of a windfall, okay, because the windfall was last year. This year is going to be a good year probably, but, you know, after this year, you're probably not going to have those large windfalls again, is really crucial, you know, because when the time comes and the money arrives, everybody wants some of it. Everybody has an idea. I don't care what political party, I don't care what part of the economy you're from, et cetera. You know, everybody wants more money into municipalities, more into highways, more into northern development, et cetera. So that formula, I think, is really critical as well, Jim.
We should start off with $1 billion in this fund rather than 100 million as recommended just a decade ago.
I like the idea.
And that would likely mean then, you know, if your outlook is right, Ron, you might not see a shift in provincial spending for the next 5 or 6 years, right? Until there is some sort of windfall again.
That's exactly it, Jim. Uranium, you know, is starting to take off again. Our mines are opening here in Saskatchewan. They are. You know, it looks, given the number of nuclear plants that are on the drawing boards right now, and this is before small modular reactors even come into the equation, makes it look like you're going to see the price of uranium skyrocket. And so, you know, if you're watching the share price of Cameco, okay, I mean, they've really jumped in the past year and a half. Again, there's probably going to be better royalties out of that. You know, they're not here today, but you could take a portion of those royalties and you could say they're going to be dedicated in the future. And when you hit the trigger price or the trigger level of royalties, okay, it starts flowing. And again, if you make the decisions today and you get all party agreement on it, then you're more likely to have it be successful.
I mean, kind of these questions of timelines and midterm and long-term and short-term, I think, are really interesting. And I kind of want to steer that question towards Matt a little bit too, because I imagine you must sit in a really interesting space of private capital and kind of quarterly timeframes often, the government on a 4-year election cycle, and First Nations that, you know, I think the catchphrase is looking 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. And how, I'm wondering how those dialogues play out from your seat. Like, is there kind of stuff you can share that's generalizable?
Sure. I mean, you know, I think what's interesting is, you know, the Indian Act and the First Nations Land Management Act require First Nations to have elections every 2 years, some are up to 4. So, I mean, they're even in a tighter election cycle. And, you know, with something, you know, like a potash project or a uranium project or, you know, other kind of projects in the mining sector that can take 15, 20 years from proposal to operation. And, you know, you're looking to have an Indigenous partner in that project. It's hypothetically possible you could deal with 10 different chiefs and councils in that window. And so what a number of Indigenous communities have started to do is to really try to put a protective barrier in place between politics and economic development and kind of follow some of the principles of the Harvard Project on the Economic Development of the American Indian. And that's certainly been successful. But, you know, from industry, you know, they're looking for Indigenous partners, not in every single case, but I would certainly say on the resource side, and some are looking for equity partners, some are, you know, choosing more, want to focus on kind of the procurement, supply chain, employment side. But, you know, those conversations are happening and you know, through the kind of development to the SIFC and since, I mean, discussions with, large banks, with financial houses, with investment firms, everybody is looking to get Indigenous investment into their portfolio for kind of some of those same reasons, whether it's about ESG scores, whether it's about impact investing, whether it's about attracting and retaining employees. And so there's really a perfect storm of a desire to bring those pieces together and finding the right projects to have those partnerships. And, I know we've, talked a lot about, resource boom and busts and non-renewable resource revenue. And I should say, as the Indigenous Economic Development branch is housed within the Ministry of Trade and Exports Investment Attraction Division, Economic Development Division, there's a real awareness and a desire to diversify beyond that, right? So, the province just released a critical mineral strategy while still mining, is really moving in a new direction and trying to encourage investment in that sector. There's a big emphasis on manufacturing. Forestry is always a sector of interest, and a lot of the more sizable investments announced recently have been in the value-added agriculture space, right? So, I would say there's an awareness of the need to kind of diversify beyond non-renewable resource revenues and to bring those investments into the province. And certainly on the resource development and value-added agriculture, sectors, we're certainly hoping that the Indigenous communities and organizations will be key partners in that as well.
Cool. Thank you, Matt. And I think we're at the point of the afternoon where I need to say thank you to all of our presenters, who are all busy people in their own right, for sharing time with us, and to the audience for coming in and asking awesome questions. This was a really enjoyable conversation for me anyway. Well, I'm grateful to all of you. So I'll let you free for your afternoons, but again,